Emma Mitchell stared out the frost-covered window of her century-old craftsman house. Since her husband had passed away 6 months earlier, the house had become both her refuge and her prison. Tonight, snow blanketed the neighborhood, muting the world outside. The soft glow of Christmas lights on neighboring houses felt like an accusation, a reminder of the joy she no longer felt. She jumped slightly at the sound of a knock at the door. Pulling her shawl tighter, Emma walked to the entrance. Through the textured glass, she recognized Harold, her elderly neighbor. He was bundled in a thick coat. She hesitated before opening the door. "Good evening, Emma," Harold said with a kindly smile. "I know you've been keeping to yourself, but I'd hate for you to spend Christmas Eve alone. Won't you join me for dinner?" Emma's initial instinct was to decline, but the sincerity in his eyes and the gnawing emptiness inside her persuaded her otherwise. "That's very kind of you, Harold. I suppose I could join you," she said softly. Harold's house was a short walk from hers, and Emma found herself shivering as much from the biting wind as from a strange apprehension she couldn't quite place. His house was similar in style to hers, though it had aged less gracefully. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, and one of the porch lights flickered erratically. Inside, the space was warm but cluttered. Faded wallpaper adorned the walls, and mismatched furniture filled the room. Harold ushered her into the dining area, where the table was set with mismatched plates and silverware. The centerpiece was a candle holder, with long twisted candles that dripped wax onto the tablecloth. "It's not much, but it's home," Harold said, pulling out a chair for her. She offered a polite smile and sat down. Over the first course, a simple soup, Harold's conversation was light. He spoke of the snowstorm, the neighborhood, and his late wife. But as the evening progressed and Harold poured wine liberally, his tone shifted. "You know," he began, swirling his glass, "your house has quite the history." Emma stiffened. "Oh, I don't know much about it." Harold's eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "Built in 1923, beautiful craftsmanship. But the stories, they're what make it unique." "Stories?" she asked cautiously. "Oh yes, the original owner, a cabinet maker named Arthur Bellamy, poured his soul into that house. They say he was kind of peculiar, obsessed with his work, but after he finished the house he simply vanished." Emma's spoon paused midair. "Vanished? No trace of him. His wife claimed he went mad, hearing voices from the wood itself." Harold chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Of course, that's just folklore." The room seemed colder, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Emma's gaze drifted to the candlelight, which cast distorted shadows on the walls. The shadows stretched and shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make her uncomfortable. "And then there were the Stevensons," Harold continued, "a young couple who bought the house in the 50s. They didn't stay long. Rumor was the wife claimed to see things. Said the carvings in the woodwork moved when she wasn't looking." Emma's grip tightened on her wine glass. She'd always admired the intricate woodwork in her house, especially the banisters and door frames. But now the thought of it sent a shiver down her spine. "Harold, why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice strained. He leaned back, a thin smile playing on his lips. "Just neighborhood lore. Thought you might find it interesting." As they moved to dessert, Harold's stories grew darker. He described a string of incidents tied to the house, owners who met untimely ends, tenants who fled in the night, whispers of something lingering within the walls. The more he spoke, the more Emma felt as if the house she'd taken refuge in was listening, absorbing every word. "You live alone there, don't you?" Harold asked suddenly, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Emma nodded hesitantly. "Must be quiet." "I like the quiet," she said defensively. Harold's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, but sometimes, too much quiet can make you hear things that aren't there." When Emma returned home, the house felt different. The familiar creaks of the floorboards and the hum of the radiator now seemed sinister. She walked into the living room and stared at the intricate woodwork framing the fireplace. Harold's words echoed in her mind. She claimed the carvings moved when she wasn't looking. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the unease. But as she turned to leave the room, she caught a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. Spinning around, she found nothing amiss. The carvings were as they had always been, intricate and still. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in bed, listening to the house settle. Each creak and groan seemed deliberate, as if the house was shifting to some unseen rhythm. Around 3 a.m., she thought she heard a faint tapping. It was irregular, coming from the direction of the living room. Her throat tightened as she forced herself to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, she descended the stairs. The tapping grew louder as she approached the living room. She aimed the beam at the fireplace, where the carving seemed to dance in the flickering light. "Who's there?" she demanded. The tapping stopped. Over the next few days, Emma's unease grew. She started noticing small changes around the house. Objects slightly out of place, doors left ajar when she was certain she'd closed them. And always, the woodwork seemed different. Subtle shifts in the patterns as if they were rearranging themselves. She decided to confront Harold. Marching to his house, she knocked firmly on the door. When he answered, his expression was unreadable. "Emma, what a surprise. What's really going on with my house?" she demanded. "You know more than you're letting on." Harold's gaze hardened. "You should leave it alone, Emma. The house has its own way of keeping secrets." "What does that even mean?" she snapped. He sighed, stepping aside to let her in. Once inside, he lowered his voice. Arthur Bellamy didn't just vanish. He became part of the house. His obsession with the wood, it consumed him. And now, it consumes others. Emma stared at him, incredulous. "You expect me to believe that?" Harold's expression was grim. "Believe what you want, but that house doesn't let go easily, and neither do I." That night, Emma resolved to prove Harold wrong. She began researching the house's history, poring over old newspapers and records. The stories were chillingly consistent. Unexplained disappearances, violent incidents, tenants leaving in terror, and always, the focus returned to the woodwork, described in one article as living art. As the days passed, the house's behavior grew more erratic. Shadows stretched impossibly long, objects moved on their own, and the tapping returned, now accompanied by faint whispers. Emma's nerves were frayed, but she refused to leave. This was her home, her last connection to her husband. Emma's research took on an obsessive quality. Her grief over her husband's death, combined with Harold's provocative stories, began to unravel her perception of reality. The old house, with its creaking floors and shadowy corners, became a canvas for her mounting psychological distress. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a grief counselor Emma had been seeing sporadically, recognized the signs of complicated grief and potential onset of a dissociative disorder. Emma's isolation, her recent loss, and her growing paranoia about the house were classic symptoms of a mind struggling to process profound emotional trauma. The mind is remarkable in how it creates narratives to make sense of loss, Dr. Hartwell would later report in her clinical notes. In Emma's case, the house became a metaphor for her unprocessed grief, a living entity holding her memories, trapping her in a moment of profound pain. Emma's perception of movement and sound became increasingly fragmented. What she interpreted as supernatural occurrences were, in fact, classic manifestations of grief-induced hallucinations. The tapping she heard was likely the sound of her own heightened anxiety, the shifting woodwork, a projection of her internal psychological landscape. When neighbors finally reported her prolonged absence, the investigation revealed a deeply troubling picture. Emma had been experiencing a severe mental health crisis, likely triggered by complicated grief and prolonged isolation. Her research materials, newspaper clippings, historical documents, and handwritten notes revealed a mind desperately constructing elaborate narratives to avoid confronting her profound loss. Harold's role was more mundane, but equally tragic. An elderly neighbor struggling with his own mental decline, he had inadvertently fueled Emma's fragile psychological state with his rambling, potentially fabricated stories about the house's history. Psychiatric experts who reviewed the case noted the classic progression of Emma's mental state: isolation, obsessive behavior, and eventually, a complete detachment from reality. The house wasn't haunting her, she was haunting herself, trapped in a psychological labyrinth of grief and loneliness. Emma was eventually found, deeply withdrawn, in a state of acute psychological distress. She was admitted to a specialized care facility, her connection to reality tenuous, but not entirely severed. The house stood empty, no longer a mysterious entity, but a silent witness to one woman's profound emotional journey. In the end, the most terrifying presence was not some supernatural force, but the very human capacity to construct entire worlds from pain, grief, and unprocessed trauma.